Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to continuing. My name is Raina Neufeld. I am a teacher here in Peace and Conflict Studies. I am Mennonite. I am a settler. I have lived here in the Haldimand Tract area for about a decade. And my forebears, I talked to you yesterday about the ones who arrived and settled in Treaty 1 territory. I also have ones that moved to Minnesota and then up into Treaty 6 territory in the Rostern area in 1895, I believe is the exact year. So it is, yeah. So, and that will matter because it helps understand why I like Saskatoon berries a lot and why that's something I share in common with our keynote speakers. And it is really my tremendous honor to be able to introduce to you this morning our keynote speakers, Laurie Campbell and Maria Campbell. I'll just have a short story. I remember meeting Laurie for the first time. So she started working here at the University of Waterloo and came to a meeting with us. We were meeting, she started as the director of the Waterloo Indigenous Students Center that Bangishimo spoke of, and she joined us at Grebel. We were having a conversation about the garden out here that Marlene referenced, and we talk about it as our settler garden because it commemorates when Mennonites arrived here without acknowledging that other people were here already. And at that first meeting, Laurie walked in and she was direct and she was wise, and she helped us take some first concrete steps. And for that, we are so grateful that you have stuck with us since those moments to keep us walking on a journey together. Laurie is Two-Spirit Nehio Apitakosasan Isqueo, but with band membership at Montreal Lake Cree First Nation, Treaty 6 territory in Northern Saskatchewan. She's the Associate Vice President, Indigenous Engagement at the University of Regina, and she's an intergenerational survivor of an Indian residential school system and child from the 60s scoop. She's made a career advocating for social justice and work towards a more equitable society in a lot of different ways. Laurie speaks nationally, internationally, and has helped to advance processes of indigenization, reconciliation, and decolonization. Maria Campbell, who is joining us via Zoom, is a renowned Cree-Métis author, filmmaker, playwright, scholar, and elder. You might know her from her 1973 memoir, Half-Breed, which is a foundational work of literature that really opened eyes to Métis life. Maria has published numerous other books and plays and has written and directed films as well. She has mentored on and inspired many Indigenous artists to find their voice. Among her many, many honors and awards are the Gabrielle Dumont Order of Merit, 6 honorary doctorates, and she's also an officer of the Order of Canada. Maria Campbell is also known to us on the planning committee as Laurie's auntie, and also through the story that she memorably shared you've heard about, there was a gathering on Indigenous and Mennonite relations 22 years ago in Winnipeg, and so Maria Campbell spoke at that gathering and shared the story of Kukum Mariah and the Mennonite Misses. So please join me in welcoming Laurie Campbell and Maria Campbell.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Raina. We had my auntie on Zoom, and I think we're just trying to get her sound back on, but I'm just the little Saskatoon berries, I'm gonna start with that. I understand that's an acquired taste, but I didn't know that. I just thought everybody, why wouldn't you love Saskatoon berries? And one day when I was on campus, I was walking by the environment building, and I saw this bush that looked very familiar. And lo and behold, and they were calling it this service, there was this little sign like naming it and they're calling it a service berry. And I'm like, I don't know what a service berry is, but them there are Saskatoons and I'm gonna pick them all. Because people here weren't really eating them. And so a little while later, I had a student working with me who was from Manitoba, a Métis student, and she was my assistant, and that was one of their jobs, was to go pick the berries for me. So not my little secrets out there, but you definitely should try them because they're just truly an amazing thing, but very prairie. Okay, so we have no sound, but she's there. Can she hear us? Okay. I'm just going to text her. She's a savvy cookum, she can text. I can also start because she comes in a little bit later as far as speaking, so we'll see if we can get her back on. And just give me a shout or she'll send me a text if we can't. But yeah, and so, just a sincere thank you as well for inviting my auntie and me to share with you today. It's an honor to come back to the University of Waterloo, and I have a lot of really great memories here and great relations that I have built. And it's also a double honor because I've never actually presented with my auntie in any sort of public space. Of course, we spend time together, but we've never actually presented together. So hopefully we can get her back on the Zoom. But I'm going to do my best to weave together a few stories today with the hopes that everyone's takeaway will be to hold in public memory the intergenerational allied relationships that have existed between some Indigenous and Mennonite peoples from within my family, and, like we've heard today, some of yours as well. But before I get started, I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of these lands who have welcomed my auntie and me today. We acknowledge that these lands are deeply connected to the Indigenous peoples who have historically lived and who currently live in this territory. And, there's Auntie, like the lands of our ancestors, the Nahiawak and Métis peoples in Treaty 6 territory, we recognize that these particular lands have always been the source of learning for Indigenous peoples here. And as guests here on the Haldimand Tract, we are committed to respecting the traditional knowledge that Indigenous peoples here have derived from these lands and to learning from their experiences on them. And I invite you all to do the same, those of you that are here on the Haldimand Tract and those of you that are joining us from afar, to recognize the territories that you are joining us from today. Indigenous author Thomas King starts off all his lectures stating, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." His work explores how stories shape who we are and how we understand and interact with other people. I did not have the opportunity to grow up and with my auntie in my life because I had been stolen away from my family through the 60 scoop, and we've heard other folks here as well speak to that experience. But therefore, for a long time, I did not learn of the stories that have shaped our family. But once I reconnected with her, some nearly 25 years ago now, I have taken every opportunity that I can to learn from our stories. Further, I have learned in our culture that we believe in something called 7 generations thinking, which was also shared a little bit with us earlier today. This way of thinking means that we must take into consideration that our decisions and ways of engaging with one another will have impact on people 7 generations from now. It means not only considering the effects on our future children's children and grandchildren, but also looking out for the children 7 generations from now. Now that's long-term thinking. But what it also means, and I think this is one of the coolest parts, is that 7 generations ago, our ancestors were making the best decisions possible, building the best relationships that they could at the time, thinking ahead to our existence many years forward. I think that 7 generations thinking is a very powerful way of thinking, and it teaches us how to walk in the present, being mindful of how our actions will have consequences in the future, perhaps even in ways that are not immediately obvious to us. This way of thinking requires us to recognize the responsibility we have to each other, to you, and to me, and to those who will come in the future. And it also acknowledges the perceptiveness and strength in those who came before us. Our Indigenous ancestors thought of future communities in their actions of long ago. And from what I have heard over the last 2 days, Mennonite ancestors did the same. And I just think that's a beautiful thing, and I want to acknowledge that. Today, I want to weave together some of the intergenerational stories from within our family and our encounters with Mennonite peoples, with the hopes that future Indigenous and Mennonite peoples will maintain and continue to build allied relationships moving forward, 7 generations from now. I think that's the goal we should be aiming for. As I mentioned, Raina mentioned, I am Cree-Métis from Treaty 6 territory. In 2017, I moved out here to the Haldimand Tract to take on the role of director of Shatitsirótha, the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center. Very early on, I was welcomed by several folks over here at Conrad Grebel, Raina, Marlene, to name a couple. I thought that this was my first real encounter with, and maybe the first for my entire family, with Mennonite people. But gosh, was I ever wrong? Although it would take close to a year later, I think, for me to learn of this. Within the first few months of my time here, many students, staff, and faculty from Conrad Grebel would consistently join us at the Indigenous Student Center for our infamous Thursday soup and bannock lunches. Casual but ongoing acquaintances were made, and we visited while breaking bread. Shortly after I arrived, my team received an invitation to have a tour of Brubaker House. We felt very welcomed, and we learned a lot as we were toured throughout the house and the surrounding landscape. And then we all sat down for a home-cooked lunch. We broke bread, and we visited. For the most part, I don't know how to describe it other than it just felt comfortable. It felt familiar. But as we were enjoying our lunch, a conversation surfaced, bringing to light that during our tour and learning about the local Mennonite history, there seemed to be a complete erasure of the original peoples, of Indigenous peoples. It was as though we had never existed within that space. As we shared food and were enjoying the comfort of our growing relationship as colleagues, as peers, I asked the question, where are the stories of the Mennonite encounters at Brubaker House with Indigenous peoples? I wondered where we were within the stories. Had the Mennonites truly never encountered us? At the time, no one in the room was able to specifically answer the question about the encounters at Brubaker House. I also thought at the time it was the Mennonite community's responsibility to learn of their encounters with us. Little did I know that I would soon to learn the history of my own family's relationship with Mennonite people. Our time together for the day at Brubaker House ended comfortably. As I reflected on this new and growing relationship, I remember thinking about the similarities within our communities, the kindness, the welcoming atmosphere, the sharing of homemade, down-to-earth food, the non-judgmental ways of engaging in conversation, and the genuine curiosity about our collective histories, the ways in which outsiders had often formed inaccurate opinions of us or marginalized us. A short few months later, I was invited to a meeting here at Conrad Grebel, the meeting Raina was speaking about. A team had gathered to discuss the possibility of hosting an Indigenous Mennonite Encounters conference as a continuation of an Aboriginal Mennonite Relations Conference that had been held in Winnipeg in 2000. Not only did I not know that there had been a conference there, but I was soon to find out how I was connected to me and my family going back 5 generations. But before we delved into that, Grebel team members shared they had done some digging. They had asked around, heard some stories, and read some journals. And they had learned something new about Indigenous and Mennonite encounters in years gone past at Brubaker House. Among other stories, they had learned that one time some Indigenous weary travelers were passing through, and the family that had resided there had invited them in. They had dinner together, they spent the night, and the next day they were on their way. What a story. Just a very simple one, really, but it did speak to the kindness and compassion of a Mennonite family, and it did provide another narrative about Indigenous peoples, one that was not in line with the often savage and brutal stories that many across the lands had presented about us. And more importantly to me, was the commitment that when tours were to be provided at Brubaker House, this small story of an Indigenous Mennonite encounter would be shared, erasing us no more. The group conversation then turned back towards discussing what was to come to be today's conference and the realization of why I was at the table. You see, it wasn't just because I was the director of Shatitsirótha. I had a history from within my own family that I had not yet learned. I was soon to realize that at the Aboriginal Mennonite Relations Conference in 2000, some 20 years earlier, my auntie, Maria Campbell, had provided the keynote lecture, speaking of her great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Kukum Maria, and her dear friend who lived up the road, the Mennonite midwife known as the Mrs. The Mennonites arrived in Saskatchewan in the late 1890s. Shortly thereafter, 5 generations ago from me, Kukum Maria and the Mrs., an Indigenous Mennonite allied relation, had been established. But before my auntie shares a story of who the Mrs. was and how she is connected to our family, I was checking to see if she was texting me. My phone buzzed. It wasn't her. Sure, it's okay. But before my auntie shares a story of who the Mrs. was and how she is connected to our family, I want to share a little bit of what happened prior to the arrival of the Mennonites in our area. And I will do my best to share this by sharing through mostly my auntie's words, what some of you may have already heard at the conference in 2000. I do this also as a way to learn the stories of my family so that they can live on. Now, in my auntie's version, she uses words from our original language, Cree, a language which she is fluent, and a language which I am still very much trying to learn. But I will do my best. And here is her story, and also mine. Today in the area where our family is from is called Park Valley, but prior to 1925, it was known as Nagiawan, which means the stopping place in our Cree language. Kukum Maria's people used to stop there on their way to their hunting and trapping territory, which was across Waktakau Sipi, net-throwing river, where her mother-in-law, auntie's great-grandmother, lived with several other families. Haiaki katawasik oma skiakias. Oh my, this land used to be so beautiful, Kukum Maria would tell Auntie as they drove by wagon through the countryside. To Auntie's young eyes, it was still beautiful, but Kukum remembered when it was still old-growth forest and the trees were so big that 3 men together couldn't put their arms around one, and she would point out the different landmarks and make my auntie say the Cree names. Kisewenu, Isputanawao, Old Man Hills, where Auntie's father and my mushum, my grandfather, hunted deer. Omisamau Pasqua, Oldest Sister Prairie, the place where they picked the medicines Kukum Maria used for midwifery. And Nottikeo Sagaigan, Old Woman's Lake, the place of ceremony. Around 1915, the federal government decided to turn the territory around Nottikeo Sagigan into a national park, and the families who had lived there for as long as they could remember, were told they had to get out. So they moved to Nagiwin, where they were joined by other displaced non-status Indian and Métis families. They built homes, planted gardens, and continued to live as trappers and hunters until the 1920s, at which time Nagiwin and the land around it was opened for homesteading. Among the homesteaders to come were the Mennonite people. A few Métis families also took homesteads, but the majority of them didn't, moving instead into the road allowances and becoming road allowance people. And this reminded me of what Raina had shared in her presentation yesterday, speaking about becoming bona fide settlers and that they were squatters no more. And while Mennonite people were becoming bona fide settlers and squatters no more, our people were becoming the squatters, the road allowance people in our own territories. Within a short time, the land was cleared, a post office and store were built, names were changed. Nagiwin became Park Valley, Paktahau CP became Sturgeon River, Kiseyanu Ispuktanawao became Ladder Hills, Omisamau Pasqua became Bergen's Meadow, and Nottegeo Sagiagan became Maria Lake. Cookam's homeland and history were erased. Now, fast forward to that lunch that several of us here shared a few years ago at Brubaker House. I reflect upon the conversation of Indigenous erasure and acknowledge the work that was done to remember Mennonite encounters with Indigenous peoples. I am not from this territory, but perhaps further research to remember the Indigenous names of the landscape that existed since time immemorable of the land in which Brubaker House resides could be undertaken and placed again in the public memory. Now, when we had that dinner at Brubaker House, I did not know the names of some of the dishes that were prepared and shared with me and my team, but I do remember they were delicious. And I do remember the feeling of being with family and having good relations as we feasted together. A story my auntie shared with me a few weeks ago reminded me of the unfamiliarity of some of the dishes, and her story made me laugh. And so I invite my auntie to share with us, first, how the missus is connected to our family, and then a funny little story about unfamiliar foods.
Thank you, Laurie, and good morning. I'm sorry I didn't get on right away, and I apologize to Laurie because I couldn't make something work here. But anyway, I feel really honored to be here for a second time, never thinking that I'd be eventually co-doing this with her, and I feel really honored about that. My granny, our Nokum, was a midwife, and she birthed probably babies right up until she was in her 80s, and she trained many midwives and birthed just about everybody in the area that we came from. And our granny was, you'd never believe, because Laurie and I are both very tall. We're the tallest in our family. Everybody else is, top height is 5'8". But our granny was really little. She was probably about 5 feet if she was that tall, and she was really tiny boned. And she had long braids, little skinny braids when I remember. And the missus was a big, strong woman. She wasn't really tall, but she was big. And so they made kind of an odd couple. But when I say couple, they really almost were a couple because they spent so much time doing all kinds of work together. But as I said, my granny was a midwife, and one day she was delivering a baby, and she was afraid she was going to lose both the mother and the baby. And she had heard that there was a midwife in the Mennonite community down the road from us. And so she sent my dad to find her and bring her back. And so my father rode horseback and went into the community and came back with the missus. And I asked him many years later, why did they call her the missus? And he said, nobody really knew what her name was, because her husband always called her that, and so everybody else in our community called her the missus. We thought that was her name. We didn't realize that the missus meant somebody's wife. We just assumed that was her name. And so whenever I hear the missus today, I have to laugh, because I just get this image of her right away, and her old man calling her that. But anyway, they saved the baby and they saved the mom. And the two of them became very good friends. It was the first time they had met. And they did everything together. They picked medicines together. They walked everywhere. They were amazing walkers. They both had walking sticks. And I was just a little girl. I probably was about 4 years old. I might have been younger. But I was the first grandchild and the first great-grandchild in our family. And so first great-grandchildren are always given to the old people, to either the grandparents or to the grandmother. And the reason for that is really obvious. It was a way to make sure that somebody retained the language and cultural teachings, because all of those things were outlawed. So I was privileged to all kinds of things, like ceremonies, getting up in the middle of the night, going to ceremonies, and probably would have been a midwife if midwifery hadn't been outlawed, which it was in the really early 1950s or late 1940s. I can't remember exactly when. Other than that, my third youngest brother was the last to be delivered by a midwife. But they did all of this work together. If either one of them had difficulty, they would consult each other. They would help one another. And the funny story that Laurie's talking about is, and this one I remember because I have never seen a pig head in my life. We didn't have pigs, and we never left our community. And so I never saw a pig, and neither, probably my grandmother had never been around one. But we came to her house one day to pick up some plants. And because they used to exchange, the missus always had flowers and medicinal plants, and she would dig them up and give them to my grandma. And we received a message that we had to give these, come by and pick them up. Anyway, we came to pick them up, and there was this wonderful smell coming from the house. You could smell it as soon as you got into the yard close to the house. And the missus was in the other room, and nobody ever knocked on doors in those days. So my grandma and I just went in. And this pot was boiling on the stove, a great big pot, like a huge pot. It was cast iron, which is what everybody used to use. And so my Nokam went over there, and she lifted up this lid, and this pig head was in there, and she screamed and dropped the cover. And I remember being so scared, because my grandmother was never afraid of anything, and to have her scream at whatever was cooking. So I climbed up on a chair to see what it was, because she started to laugh and couldn't quit laughing, and the missus came running in. And there was this pig head bouncing around in this boiling water, and it just looked absolutely awful. And it scared me. And I just remember how hard they laughed, the two of them. And about a month later, my grandma was cleaning, was doing a moose, helping my mom cut up this moose. And we had spent most of the afternoon cleaning the moose nose, which is a delicacy for our people. And then it takes about 5 hours to clean this, because you have to singe it and scrape it, very much as I learned, like you do with a pig. And so we got it all done. I say we because I had to help her. I was learning. And we got it all finished, and she put it in this big cast iron pot outside and left it to boil. And it was my job to go and throw wood in there every so often. Anyway, the missus came by, and we could hear her outside. My grandma came out, and she was standing by the fire looking into this pot, and this moose nose was bubbling straight up. It was kind of standing up, if you can imagine moose nose standing up, and the boiling water was coming out of its nostrils, and it scared her. She didn't know what on earth it was. And so I always remember the two of them laughing so hard over these two noses, and it was something that they talked about for a long time. And again, I cook and clean moose nose every so often, and I always think of the two of them whenever I have moose nose or I eat head cheese, because that was a real delicacy. The missus would make fresh bread, and my grandma would make fresh bannock outside for the moose nose, and we would always share food like that. But it was a story, I never forgot that. The two old ladies talked all the time. They never stopped talking to each other. And I asked my father many, many years later, how did they understand each other? Because my great-grandmother didn't speak English. She only spoke Cree-Métis. And I'm sure the missus couldn't talk English either, because we never heard it. Well, we wouldn't have understood. But she did speak Low German. That's what everybody spoke. And so that's how they talked to each other. My dad said that, he said whatever language she spoke, that's what she talked. And the two of them, I remember walking with the two of them, and they'd be laughing and talking. And I don't know how they understood each other, but it's just beautiful when I think about how people can communicate without, the way that they did. Anyway, thank you for listening to that story.
Thank you for sharing that, Auntie. I know when she told that story to me a couple of weeks ago, it sure made me laugh, and I can only imagine, what that experience might have been like, looking into those pots in each other's kitchen. But it also made me think, I don't quite remember the names of all the foods I ate at Brubaker House, but I'm pretty sure one wasn't a boiled pig head, but I'm not sure. Sausage. Anyways, it was delicious all the same. Sometime later, during my time here at the Student Center, we created the Ceremonial Firegrounds, a place on campus where Indigenous peoples can gather for ceremony and invite in guests to learn and provide support to build relationships. Some of you may have been there this morning or yesterday morning. Firekeeper Al started the ceremonial fire yesterday and today, and if you haven't had time to go over and visit him, I encourage you to please do so and thank him for holding that space for us, so that everything that happens here yesterday and today through these conversations and tomorrow as we move forward is done in a good way. And Al likes to visit, so I'm sure he'd be more than happy just to have visitors come and to answer any questions. Anyways, when we had gatherings there, when I was here, and I'm sure continues on, there were always students, staff, and faculty that would show up from our neighbors here at Conrad Grebel, and I suspect y'all are still doing that. While there, teachings were shared, and so were our medicines. As our relationship grew, another conversation emerged, which is the beauty of what can happen when you invest in building allied relations, when you invest in spending time within and taking care of the relationship. Folks at Conrad Grebel, as Raina had shared, that in 2005, they planted a black walnut tree and garden area and erected a sign marking the 200th anniversary of the arrival in 1805, I think, of the first Mennonite settlers from Pennsylvania in this territory. But people at Conrad Grebel had realized that they had had an altered understanding of events in history. Then they went to work to rectify the situation. A community gathering amongst Indigenous and Mennonite peoples took place. I have a lot of allergies in Ontario. Excuse me, hopefully I don't sneeze. At the gathering, it was acknowledged that the tree had been placed upon the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and it was decided that a new sign should be erected that provided a more fulsome picture of the lands in which the tree and the garden area now reside on. At the Indigenous and Mennonite gathering, it was acknowledged that Mennonites, as buyers and settlers, were implicated in a larger process of Indigenous dispossession. Bringing this to public memory provided an opportunity for the folks at Conrad Grebel to think and reflect and to educate the broader community, and most of all, to engage in an allied relationship with Indigenous peoples as part of the journey towards reconciliation here on the University of Waterloo campus. At the time, I acknowledged that as someone from Treaty 6 territory, I will always be a visitor to this particular land, and that reconciliation is also not a checkbox. It's not something that's just complete. What is required is the ongoing reciprocal relational allyship. And that was and is something that I really appreciate about the folks at Conrad Grebel. This experience got me thinking about the importance of plants, gardens, and medicines. Plants are medicine. My auntie has another story about the Misses in Maria and about medicines, and I invite her to share a story about that with us now.
Okay. Keep forgetting about that. But along with thinking about moose noses and pig heads, when I think about those two old ladies and babies, I think about plants because they both of them love plants so dearly. My great-grandmother was always out digging as soon as the weather was good, because there are certain plants that you pick at certain times of the year, certain times of the summer and fall, and also she would pick medicines at certain phases of the moon, and so and some of them had to be picked in the morning and some had to be picked in the evening. So there was always so much work she had to do, and again I'd go with her because she was getting old and starting to go blind, and I called her Chichim and she called me Chichi, and Chichi means my hand, and so Chichim is somebody who's your grandmother, but they're also your teacher. Anyway, when she was ready to go, she'd grab her walking stick and say, "Astam Chichi," and off the two of us would go. I'd hold her hand to make sure that she didn't step into a hole or do anything like that. I realized today, after just having cataract surgery recently, that she probably had cataracts and they didn't have surgery in those days, because she used to use a lot of wild strawberry liquid that she would, I don't know how to say it in English, but she would use, put the plants in a little bit of water and oil, and she would leave them sit for a long time, and that's what she would use when people had difficulty with their eyes, and she used it all the time. And I've since learned that wild strawberries are for, and a lot of people with cataracts use them. Anyway, they would go picking together. We'd pick her up, or else she would come by our house and pick us up, and we would go with her. And they exchanged medicines. The missus must have come with plants from wherever she came from, because she always had a garden with plants that she would grow, and they also mixed medicines together. I remember the two of them sitting under a tree, and my grandmother always would grind her medicine and sing songs when she was doing them, and the missus would sit with her, and she wouldn't sing, but she would sit and listen to her until she was finished. And sometime I would hear her talking, and I realized today she was probably she was probably praying because she would be talking really softly. But my grandmother had medicines that were used for birthing, but also for dying. I don't know how many of you know the work of a traditional midwife, and I'm not sure if that's the same for Mennonite midwives in those days. But the midwife also looked after people who were sick. She provided palliative care, I guess you would call it today, for the family and for that person. And her helpers would help the mother or the father look after children, or just almost like a nurse. And these were young women, a young person who was learning medicines and midwifery who would do that. And when somebody died, it was the midwife who looked after them. And the old saying between, that my grandmother would say is that between life and death, it's an old lady that catches you when you come, and there's an old lady that catches you when you leave. And so an old lady has to prepare that body for leaving. And the medicine that my grandmother used, she called amua pakwani. That means like the bee's flower, because the bees love them, and where we come from, they grow all over. And I've since learned that they're called bergamot, and it was the medicine that she used, one of her main medicines that she used for birthing babies and to help the mother, and she used wolf willow for people who were dying. I would have to go out and get armloads of wolf willow and bring it in, and it would be put in the house. And what wolf willow does is it takes away the smell of death. Death has an odor. And it would keep the house smelling fresh, and we would change that every day. And I remember the two of them, because both the bergamot is a beautiful, beautiful flower. It's a purple flower, and it's my favorite color. And wolf willow, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. Our river banks here are, they're silver, and there's so many of them. And they smell amazing. They have a smell that's like nothing else that you can smell anywhere. But when I see those two plants, I always think of the two of them. And I don't know if the missus used those when she was looking after people that were dying, or if she even did that in her home, because I never went when she was doctoring her people. But I just remember those. So those two smells for me are always familiar. That plant grows outside of my house on the riverbank. And I think of them when I smell that, and it's always really strong this time of the year as it's starting to bud. And when I see fields of bergamot, they're such an amazing and beautiful plant. And those are used for birthing and for packing the mother so that she wouldn't hemorrhage. And they were used for other things. It's considered a woman's medicine. And again, that plant grows about half a mile from my house at Batoche, and there's almost an acre of it. And we haven't had any for a couple of years because there's been such a drought. But I always think of them, and I put this on today because it reminds me of the two of them, the shawl. They wore black, both of them, and dark green, and they like purple. Both of them loved purple, and those are colors that are really close to me. So, they midwifery, as I said, was outlawed, and when it was outlawed, it totally changed our community, because in our community, our midwife was also the police. She was like the police. She always knew what was happening in families. She could talk to families. She would talk to children if they were misbehaving. She would talk to parents. she, people would always listen to them. But also it meant that women had to go to the hospitals, a long way to a hospital. And the only way we had to travel was with horses. And hospitals, it was a man's job, and men weren't even allowed to come into the place where birthing was happening. It was considered women's business. And the other thing is that we had to start using funeral homes. And when you use funeral homes, your attitude and your feeling about death is totally different. It's scary, and it's the same with birthing. The way that women were, delivered their babies in the hospitals was horrifying, and it was humiliating for Indigenous women when they first had to start doing that. And to use funeral homes meant that the whole community wasn't responsible for looking after the family and looking after making the casket and dressing the body and digging the grave and doing all those things and cooking the food and looking after everybody while they were going through the mourning. And it also meant the end of our old ladies that would sing. We used to have 4 old ladies that would keen. I guess it's called keening. They would sing, and people would sit around, tell stories. They would share food at the wake. All of this would happen, and then these old grannies would. It was almost like they'd cry, and they would make everybody cry by the sound that they made. And then when we were finished crying, then we would do this. We would go back to laughing, talking, telling stories, sitting beside the coffin and remembering this person. And that all of those things stopped, and everything started to change really quickly and fast in our communities when that authority was taken away from midwives. And so I always think about those two. And when I miss them, I put on my purple shawl, and I feel better. So, thank you.
Thank you, Auntie. How beautiful are those stories of the misses in Cookham. And I realize also, as I'm still learning, listening to my auntie, that there's probably things that you are also learning, for those of you who are from the Mennonite community and hear about some of the old ways of, somebody from, a few generations ago as well. Before I share my concluding story, I do want to invite my auntie again to share a final story. And this one has humor in it, as they all do, but I also think it really exemplifies some of the best of humanity.
Anyway, I was born in April, on the 26th of April, and I was born in the middle of a blizzard in the Prince Albert National Park, which is where my family along the river, the Baktohausipi, they would, that was their trapping territory. So they would be on this side of the river, and the park was across the river. And we would, my dad and mom and my grandma were out, and my grandma, meaning my dad's mother, they were there for the muskrat trapping. And I guess my grandma came along because my mother was carrying her first baby. And so anyway, I was born in the middle of this blizzard in a tent, and I caught a cold or something, and I got very ill. And so they were really afraid I was going to die. Apparently, according to my dad, I had really high fever. And but I have to back up a little bit first because I'm telling my dad's story. But I came home one day to my father's house. He'd moved into Prince Albert, which is a small city in northern Saskatchewan. I came to, I used to come and clean house and make sure that everything was okay. I'd come on weekends. And he was quite old. And so I was really angry about something that I'd heard on the news about the Catholic Church. And I left the church after my grandmother passed away, never had anything to do with it. But anyway, I'm sitting at the kitchen table with my dad and my two brothers, and I'm complaining long and loud about the Catholic Church and whatever it had done. And my dad was eating, and he finally said, "I don't know why you're so mad at the Catholic Church all the time. You're not even a Catholic." And I said, "What do you mean I'm not a Catholic?" Because the church was nearby, we always went. And he said, that's when he said you were, and I knew I had been born in the tent. But he said, "You got really sick and you were going to die. We thought you were going to die. And your mother was so scared that you'd die without being baptized." My mother was a really heavy-duty Catholic. And so she was really upset. Nobody else was, because they believed everything was going to be okay. That we don't have teachings of heaven in our old ways, or about hell. Anyway, my mother was really upset, and this man on horseback came by, and he stopped at our camp. And my dad invited him to eat with us, and he ended up spending the evening there, I guess the night. And my mom, he told my dad that he was the minister from the Mennonite community that wasn't very far away from us. My dad called him the preacher. He said he was a preacher from the Mennonite community, from the community where Mrs. came from. And so my mother was, asked him if he could baptize me. And so he finally agreed. And I don't really know what happened, but so my dad said, "So you're not a Catholic?" He said, he said, "I think he was he called him a Mennonite." He said, "I think he was a Mennonite, but he said maybe he was a Lutheran too, because he said there was Lutherans lived over there," meaning Lutheran. And so I'm sitting there, my brothers are trying not to laugh. And I found out that I was probably a Mennonite or a Lutheran. My dad told me which church it was. And so I have a friend in the Mennonite Central Committee. His name is Leonard Dahl. And he stopped by for coffee one day, and I told him this story. And I said, "I'm probably a Mennonite. I don't know if that was, for sure if that was a Mennonite, but that's who it had to be." Anyway, he said, "Well, I hate to burst your balloon," but he said, "I don't think you're a Mennonite," because he said Mennonites don't baptize people. He said, "You have to wait until you're grown up to be baptized, to be an adult." So anyway, I don't know what I am, because I never did get baptized, I guess. But if I was, then I would, I don't know if that man had any authority to baptize me. It's just crazy when I think about it, but I was so... It's still, I have to laugh when I think of it. But it was one of my favorite stories, and I found out that maybe I was a Mennonite when I was in my 70s. I sent a note right away to my friend Rudy Weeb in Edmonton, close friend, and said, "You're never going to believe what I just found out. No wonder we're friends." Anyway, that's the...
Thank you for that, Auntie. Sorry, I got tears in my eyes. I can't read my notes. When my auntie shared that story with me, although it is like truly a funny story, like a funny little story, I also found it to be, profound, because of the deep sense of compassion, caring, and kindness that Mennonite preacher on horseback offered that day. He came across a young Indigenous family on the trap line, What he did not see were people that were less than, uneducated, or unkind. What he saw was a mother who was terrified that her infant was going to die and who desperately wanted what all mothers want, to secure love and peace for her child. And although Auntie's mother did not understand the ways of the Mennonite preacher, with all his love and compassion, provided my auntie's mother with the comfort that she needed in her time of utter distress. The Mennonite preacher, although I imagine praying in his own way, performed what he thought were the rituals that my auntie's mother needed to see and to have done to comfort her. And this particular story really truly touches me, and with it, I bring you these concluding thoughts. 5 generations ago, at nearly first contact in Treaty 6 territory, Indigenous and Mennonite encounters were occurring. First contact between Mennonite and Indigenous, not the other settlers. Relationships were being formed that didn't necessarily fit the narrative of how the broader public saw or related to Indigenous peoples, nor the Mennonites. Yet, even without knowledge of the same languages, the same foods, the same medicines, collectively, we invested in forming allied relations, perhaps also recognizing that although different, we had both had an erasure of sorts. Less than 4 years ago, I sat down at a meeting with Conrad Grebel, and I heard the story of how my auntie had provided a keynote address at the 2000 Aboriginal Mennonite Relations Conference. And I have walked just a little bit differently on Mother Earth ever since. When I look down, I see my foot being placed in the footsteps of my auntie, whose footsteps I see being placed in the footsteps of Campbell and Maria. Yes, for our family and from our territory, it may only be 5 generations, but the 7th generation is coming, and I intend to do my part to continue supporting and building strong allied relations in all future Indigenous and Mennonite encounters. And I invite you all to do the same. I'll just invite Auntie if she has any closing words before we move on to a few questions.
I want to say that my mother, according to my father, my mother suffered greatly all of her life and did lots of praying for telling the priest that I had already been baptized. And it's probably the only lie my mother ever told, but she didn't dare tell him that I was a Mennonite. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me share this time with Laurie. And I wanted to say that relations were not always great between us. We really never visited back and forth. Those were two really good relationships that happened in my life that I know about with Mennonite people, and I'll never forget that old woman. She was like a grandma to us. But I wanted to say that I worked with the Lubicon people in northern Alberta in the 90s, and also way back in the 60s. And in the 90s, I worked with a Mennonite couple who came with their children from Kansas and lived with the Lubicon Cree in the community, and were there for the year that I was there as well, and we became very good friends. And it was the first time that I really learned about the history of Mennonite people. And so it's what I want to say to all of you, and I say it with the greatest respect, is that the most important thing is to know our history, to know who we are, to know where we came from, to know what happened to us, and to know, so that we know what to do and how to avoid trauma and dispossession and all of those ugly things. And when we know who we are and what happened to us, and we're honest about that, because truth is You can't have conciliation without truth. If we can do that, and do lots of critical thinking and ask lots of critical questions of ourselves and of our own people, and have lots of critical dialogue, then we'll find out that we really have more in common than we don't have in common. And certainly those two old women proved that by not even being able to speak to speak the same language. But they cared enough about the children in their community and the babies and about life that they were able to build a relationship between the two of them. And we have to be able to do that. We're at a time when it's really critical that we have to work together. And when I say that we have more in common than we don't have in common, the only real big difference between us is that we haven't left our homeland and we're not likely to leave it. And that's the only difference, because the same kinds of tyrants, the same kinds of ugly, evil things that happened to us is what caused your ancestors to come to this country to find a good place to live. And otherwise, there's not much difference. We're born the same way, we die the same way. We can bridge our communities, be the bridge between our communities. But especially to the elders in the Mennonite community, you have to be able to do that with your generations as well, as many of us are trying to do in our community. And to have more gatherings like this, I just, we have to put all of our children in the middle and think about them, because if we don't, we're not going to have any place else to go. And I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about all of you and our children. Where are they going to go? There's no place else. This is happening all over the world, and we have to be able to make that kind of change here. So I want to thank you again for inviting me, and Laurie, thank you so much for sharing this space with me. And Creator, take care of all of you, and power to our babies, and take care of them. Thank you.
And thank you to Auntie for sharing our stories, because, again, the truth about stories is that's all we are. And it is through the stories that I've also come to know who I am. We thank you for inviting us here today, and our techs for allowing us to be present in the same room, although not physically necessarily in the same room, and for those who are joining us remotely. And I'll turn it back over to Raina. Thank you.